Ready for you.
All right, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am thrilled to have as my guest today, Gabrielle Bernstein. Gabby, welcome.
Man, I am so happy to be here. It's a long time coming. I'm a major fan of the pod, and you've been such a resource for me. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with you.
That's amazing to hear. Thank you so much. So Gabrielle Bernstein is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Universe Has Your Back, as well as Miracles Now, Spirit Junkie, and Judgment Detox. She was featured on Oprah's SuperSoul Sunday as a next generation thought leader, and the New York Times named her a new role model. She appears regularly as an expert on the Dr. Oz show and co-hosted the Guinness World Record largest guided meditation with Deepak Chopra. Gabby says, the day I chose sobriety was the day I became a spirit junkie. I started soaking up spiritual principles, meditation practices, and anything else that helped me get aligned with my true purpose, which was to be a source of love and inspiration in the world. Gabby, welcome.
Thank you.
So there's so much information out there about you. You've got all these books, and you're talking all over the place, and it's really cool just to have you here sitting in that little booth with whatever you're drinking, your tea, your coffee. And I just wanted to really find out how the heck you got here, because there's something driving you. It's clear.
This journey is all throughout. I've written 9 books in 11 years, but the most recent book that I have now, Happy Days, The Guided Path from Trauma to Profound Freedom and Inner Peace, is why I'm with you here, right? This is why I'm such a listener of your podcast, because what I've done in this book is I share the journey of what it meant to go through all the stages of recovery, from even being unaware of trauma, being dissociated from my childhood trauma, to remembering, to coming out the other side. And in the book, I talk about EMDR, EFT, SE, IFS. And I just want to nerd out here about that with you, because while I've been a spiritual teacher for 16 years, I've also been on a 42-year long, 42 now, journey of recovering from trauma. So I wrote this book from the perspective of the patient, but also the spiritual perspective of a spiritual teacher. And I share in this book from the moment I was in the car, 24 years old at the time, in my beat up white Corolla, sitting and adhering to the alternate side of the street parking. I haven't gone to sleep because I was at a party an hour ago, and I'm coming down from that party. And there's people going to work, and they've got their shoulder bags, and they've got their coffees, and they're all going somewhere, and I'm going nowhere. And I've got that red Gatorade on the ground, and it's really a tragic moment. And I keep pressing play on this cassette tape. Mm-hmm. Over and over again. And it's a psychic reading from 5 months earlier. And the psychic said, you're struggling with drugs and alcohol. And I heard my voice quiver, and I said, it's not that bad. And then she goes on, and she says, you can exercise free will in this lifetime. You can stay using and have a really tough time, or you can get clean and make a major impact on the world. And I just kept repeating that and rewinding and playing and rewinding and playing and rewinding and playing. By the grace of God, I wound up getting sober at 25. And in that sober recovery, I reclaimed my spiritual foundation. I was brought up spiritual, very spiritual, visiting ashrams, being named by the gurus, given meditation practices from my mother. And I turned my back on that for many years. And then I came back when I got sober in 12-step program. And I was so psyched to get sober. Like I was that 25-year-old that was like screaming from the rooftops, like, I love AA,
Mhm.
and I was such a seeker, all the years I was using, I still had a stack of self-help books next to my bed. And then as time went on, I really got so deeply connected to what I was doing for my personal growth and spiritual development that I started speaking about it publicly,
Mhm.
writing books on the topics. And here we are 16 years later, and I've now released the book that tells really the full story.
What led you, Gabby, to the drugs and alcohol?
So I got clean and so I'm going to answer it this way. I got clean and sober at 25. And then, but I wouldn't know until I was 36 why I was using. And so I got clean and sober. And like most addicts, I just picked up the other drugs of choice, right? So codependency, or I started workaholism. Workaholism was a big one, just overachieving. And when I was 36, around that time, a lot was changing in my life. I was newly married. I was trying to conceive. I was running this big business by myself with one virtual assistant. And my husband was going to walk away from his 10-year-long career at JP Morgan to come run my business. So a lot of the control mechanisms that I had in place were starting to be dismantled. And so just at that time, I started cracking and melting down, and then pulling myself back up, and then melting down, and then cracking, and then gastrointestinal issues, and cracking and cracking. And my mantra at the time was, I can't go on like this. Then I had a dream. And the dream was of being sexually abused as a child and then confronting it as an adult. When I woke up that morning, it was as if it had just happened. It was like so real in my body. It was so true. And then I was like, no way, man, I'm shutting that down. And I pushed it down. And a few days later, I was in therapy, and my therapist said to me something that was just a little bit opening. It was a little enough to open the door a little more. And I just immediately was flooded back into a dissociated memory and acceptance of this abuse from my childhood. Not a lot of details, but it was,
Mhm.
but it was horrific and terrifying because you go right back into it. And
Right.
in that moment, I was pretty stuck in it. And for many months I was stuck in it. But it was the biggest sigh of relief for a moment, because I said, oh, this is why I was a cocaine addict. This is why I'm a workaholic. This is why I can't be present. This is why, this is why, this is why, this is why, this is why. And that began the next level of my trauma recovery. And that's what I want to talk about with you today.
Definitely. So you have this realization, which is just so intense and crazy. How do things unfold for you in terms of needing treatment? What did you do? What are the
Mhm.
steps you
Yeah.
took?
Yeah. So, first things first, I had a little more that I was recalled. Had a therapy session days later, and I was so stuck in that moment. I was really so terrified for probably 6, 7 months. And more memories, there were these imprinted visions that I'd always had in my mind as if they were movies. You've heard this before. And those imprinted, fixated memories and visions had kind of haunted me, but I didn't have any reference for them. And now they were starting to come back in a full understanding. The closet, the window in the closet, the chest in the closet, just the visuals. Then I immediately went into body work. I started doing some somatic work, and I did some. At the time, it wasn't with an SE therapist. It was just straight, just sort of self-regulating work. And then I did a lot of right away. Did a lot of EFT. I was already trained in EFT, so I was doing EFT. Well, not. I was teaching EFT. I was practicing it for myself, so I was really familiar. So I was working with an EFT practitioner that specialized in trauma. And that's emotional freedom technique, EFT, just to clarify. And then I went into EMDR. And EMDR was really soothing to my system and really supportive for me in getting back to a safe baseline. And all the while I was practicing IFS in my therapy, but I didn't realize that it was IFS. I didn't realize it for a decade. I just was talking to parts, but I didn't know I was doing IFS. So to get to that point, I had a beautiful experience when I delivered my son, which was the beautiful gift of being blessed with suicidal postpartum depression, which I think is common for folks who have experienced trauma. It's a biochemical condition that we can't control, but I do think that it's probably even more present in women with unresolved trauma or PTSD. And at that point, I was really using like all my wellness tools and this whole wellness world that I'd been in, and meditating and trying everything I could, ashwagandha and, acupuncture and blah, to try to get to sleep at night. I was insomnia. I had agoraphobic, all of this. And but once again, by the grace of God, I hit bottom with this. And finally, my therapist intervened and was like, you need to see a psychiatrist. And so that moment was when this woman who was brought up homeopathic and had been in this wellness industry for so long and had unconsciously been part of the stigma around medication was now being prescribed an antidepressant. And for me, that was a radical turning point in my life, because I'd done so much work. This was already 3 years of trauma recovery behind me and decades of personal growth work and therapy and spiritual practice. But I was still so afraid to go into the places that scared me. There was such a huge wall up that when I sat in my psychiatrist's office, she said, I know that you're resisting this. I know that this is scary for you, but I want you to know that all of the spiritual work and all the self-help work that you've done is great, but this medication will give you a new baseline of safety so you could go deeper into the trauma healing. And I took that. That's what I took. And I said, okay, I'm going to commit to this. And it did exactly that. It gave me this new baseline to go way deeper in the IFS, to really go and retrieve the exiled parts of me. And so I really would love to share. I'm going to let you take it from here, but at some point I really want to share what my experience has been in that retrieval of really coming back to that child part.
Yeah, definitely. What's I guess I want to ask about it, and striking at the same time, is you had started this business. You had been a spiritual seeker, even while this whole trauma had still been unresolved.
Yeah, I can see now that I have a spiritual belief that our souls make a decision before we come into the body that says, okay, I'm going to sign up for that, and that, so that I can learn that. And for me, I believe that I was brought here to go through whatever I had to go through to learn what true freedom and inner peace meant, so that I could be a messenger, a raconteur, a guide to help people get there.
Right. So let's get into it. So what happens? You start taking these meds, antidepressant. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I was taking the medication, and it took several months for it to kick in properly and to get to the right therapeutic dose. Finally, it got there, and I started sleeping again and just started to feel a steadiness I'd never known. And I was realizing that I'd been living for my entire life with an undiagnosed anxiety disorder, otherwise known as PTSD. And I was starting to just feel so safe to start to slightly titrate in and out of that connection to those fearful, exiled, shame, rageful, grief parts, the child parts that were so under lock and key. And so I was doing three therapy sessions a week.
Wow.
And I recognized the privilege I had to do that, just like having like Deepak Chopra on speed dial and like, any, whatever it was, all the resources, the financial resources to do that. And so I wanted to really commit wholly and fully, use the resources I had to get the help I needed so that I could come out the other side and tell the story and to be free for myself. And so I was doing SE, IFS, and EMDR weekly, because I wasn't going to just take the pill and be like, I'm good, because that wasn't going to work. That might have settled my system a little bit, but it wasn't going to heal the wound or the patterns or the behaviors. And so I really started to dive deep into the IFS in particular. And it was strange because I was doing it for so many years, but I didn't know it was IFS. And then randomly, I just started, not randomly, I was just, really listening to you and listening to all of the trauma recovery content I could get my hands on. And of course, I was guided to Dick Schwartz. And I was like, holy shit, that's what I've been doing for a decade. And then I became obsessed with IFS and wanting to learn more and start taking all the trainings. And then I befriended Dick and I interviewed him on my podcast, became friends with him, and then took level 1. Most recent, I just graduated from
Wow.
IFS, and I find so much similarity. And he's agreed that I can say this, but he can't, because in the clinical space, it's hard for folks to sort of talk about the spiritual side of it. But all of the processes I was led to are very spiritual therapeutic processes, SE, EMDR, IFS. So I took the training and I started to really see how similar IFS was to already the foundational spiritual faith that I had. I'd always believed that with these fear-based parts of ourselves that needed to be brought to God, to a higher power, to our higher self for healing so that they could be resolved. And similarly in IFS, we have self, which is an ever-present energy of love and compassion and courage and just calmness and curiosity and that all those C qualities. And when we get a direct access from those fear-based parts, when those overactive protector parts, and we can connect them to self, they can become less extreme. And in that less extreme role, we can then settle enough to, with the help of a licensed therapist in IFS, begin to touch into the exiled child parts that have been so tucked away.
Mm-hmm. Was there a lot of fear once you started taking the medication? First of all, I'm wondering if there was, what was going on, what kind of feelings were coming up for you when you decided to take the medications? Was there, oh my God, I have to do this, or I should do this, or?
By that point, I was so desperate. And I'm actually grateful that I hit bottom before I got on the meds because it allowed me to commit to them.
Right.
Because I just went for so many months undiagnosed and trying to fix it with all these, spiritual and wellness modalities, and it wasn't working.
Mm-hmm.
I actually realized, Guy, that for decades I'd kind of been part of the stigma. Like people would come into my audiences and they'd be like, I'm so depressed, I can't get out of bed, I'm suicidal. And I'd be like, try this meditation. And honestly, like that's like saying fuck you to somebody who's having a biochemical condition, because that's not going to work in the moment.
Right.
If you're having a serious acute condition, you need greater support. And what I came to accept for myself was that God was in the medication, that God was in the doctors, that God was in the therapist and the psychiatrist, and in you when I listened to your pod, and in the meds. And I'm a woman of faith, and I've always trusted that I was being guided to exactly what I needed, no matter how much I resisted it.
Mm-hmm.
I would get there. And so I saw, okay, this God's handing me a boat. Better get on the boat.
As you started working through this, Gabby, with IFS and so forth, what shifted for you in terms of what you felt your mission was?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yesterday, I was on the phone with my therapist, and I just was like really exhausted, noticing that that old part of being overworked was showing up because I have so much on my plate at this moment, launching this book. But I said to her, listen, it's so different. I witnessed that part not as a workaholic right now, but I see her as a woman on a mission. I see her as a woman who's going to take care of herself along the way and connect to self energy as much as that part can. But she's on a mission more than ever before, that part wants to do everything in her power to make sure that those who need this book can receive it, because it's for the folks that may not find their way to you. It's for the folks that are not going to necessarily find their way to a IFS therapist or an SE therapist. They may not have the resources. They may not even have any awareness that that's something that's there. It's for the folks that have been then spiritually bypassing. It's for the folks that have been numb, addicted. And it gives them an opportunity to recognize they're not alone and a path forward. So it's mandatory right now that I let that part do her job.
If you were talking to someone who was in your position, maybe before they saw that psychiatrist and they started doing IFS, if you could talk to someone who was in that position, what would you say to them? What would they need to hear?
Right before they had the psychiatrist and that kind of support, and they didn't know that they were going to get there, and they didn't know how they were going to get there, I would say I would send them a copy of this book, and I would write in it, stay willing. Because all that the reader needs is the slightest willingness to be guided to what is their next right action in their recovery journey. And the reason I would send them this book, and look, there's other books out there that I would send them to, but this book I really would send them because it is a door opener. It's a guide to awakening the conscious awareness of the fact that you've been running, what you've been running, and helping you gently touch into what you've been running from. And also with, really encouraging all the way through, get the guidance of a therapist, and then giving them the path that I went on so that they can choose from it what they want to use.
I want to go back to that statement you said earlier on when there were examples when you would talk to people and they might say, well, I'm having a difficult time. And you would say, well, you should do so-and-so meditation. Say more about how things have shifted for you in that sense.
I'm a meditation teacher. I'm a spiritual teacher. I filled my book, this most recent book, with countless self-regulating methods. And I believe that they're all absolutely necessary on the healing path for studying your systems, bringing yourself back to safety for the moment, calming your nerve, getting out of a panic attack, falling back to sleep. All of those moment-to-moment practices, and even repetitive practices, particularly meditation, have a profound impact on your brain, on your nervous system, and your neural pathways. But I would add to that now that it's and more, because we can use all those practices for self-soothing along the way, which I did. They were all my self-soothing practices that I came back to and came back to. I was like, and I still use them every day. I used them right before. I just did my meditation right before I joined you. But I would say, let those practices be a support system while you go into a therapeutic setting and do deeper work. Unapologetically, I would say that right now.
Right.
And then there's somebody listening, I can't afford therapy. Thankfully I've got, there are a lot more now because of COVID services out there that are free or a better price for folks who can't afford treatment.
What is your mission now? You are so, come on, you've written nine books. You're speaking all over the place. You've obviously got this drive. What do you want to do? What are you doing? What is your mission, do you think? Do you know?
Yeah. After going through the IFS training, I think it really solidified for me. It's similar to what I've always been in the pursuit of, but it's much more clear now that I have direct access to self energy. And I'm using that. So in IFS, your people probably know this, but we'll just demystify it a bit. In IFS, we have self energy, which is the curious, compassionate, undamaged, resourced, compassionate, loving, caring, calm part of us. the God within us. And then we have all these different other parts. You've got the protectors that are the addicts and the alcoholics and the ragers and the overworkers that are really in place to numb out the exiles, which are the child parts. And so through my IFS journey, my personal IFS journey, I've gotten a direct line of access to self energy. I've gone all the way through to, retrieval and bringing those child parts back to me. I have direct access from self to the child parts, direct access from the self to protectors. Many of my I would say all of my protectors have taken a real chill pill. Okay. They're like on Zoloft now. Just kidding. But my protectors are really relaxed. They've just stepped aside and they're not active. They're not overly active. And then when I notice them in any way get activated, I bring self energy in to soothe. And so from that place, my mission is very different. It's not very different. It's the same. It's just more clarified to me. Mm-hmm. My mission is to help people connect to self energy, to help people find their way to that direct access to their own self energy. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would say my mission is to crack people open to a spiritual awareness of their own understanding. I think that that's the same thing. Mm-hmm. Just a different language.
As you say that, I'm thinking to myself, that's a very clear mission. And even if it's not obviously, it's not always easy to get access to who we are, to ourselves. It's like a daily challenge. It's a daily slog sometimes. Mm-hmm. And why?
Because the protectors are so strong. The protectors are so comfortable and safe in their patterns, because it's far too terrifying to contemplate what it would be like to connect to or touch into those child parts. And so the protectors are how run the show. And the protectors don't necessarily know self is there. And so it's about, through this beautiful through IFS work, and I'm going to shout it from the rooftops, I think it's the most profound. It's the thing that really clicked it all in for me. Mm-hmm. Dick's going to get a lot of emails from people. I've been just IFSing all over the internet. But having that, developing that connection to self to parts relationship through IFS, through some of the stories, through the methods in my book. Even in my book, I don't ever touch exiles, and nor will I in public settings. And it's just not my interest. I'm not there. I'm not the therapist. I want to help using this tool to help people connect to self energy and let their parts settle, knowing that self is there. And when I introduce those parts to self, that's my job. Self can then take over. Their self can take over. But what I really do in this book, I give them self meditations for connecting to self. And so that would be a good start. It's just starting to use your spiritual practice or use your breath practice to start to notice the part of the inner awareness of compassion and courage, curiosity, calm, to start to tap into those qualities of yourself and listen to them. Maybe journal with them. Mm-hmm. Maybe turn to that self and say, next time you notice that you're in a triggered place, instead of saying, oh, that's who I am, and judging yourself, right, say, oh, that's a protector part. And she or he or it just needs a little compassion right now.
That's one of the things I really like about IFS, and I've certainly used it in my own therapy. It allows for compassion for the other parts of you that might be really easy to judge and to shame, but it allows that compassion for those sides and parts of us that we all have that sometimes we don't want to reveal or look at. But I want to say this, Gabby, one of the things, I really appreciate and admire about you is there's a courageousness that you have. You're not sitting here saying you've got all the answers and everything's perfect and you've written all these books and blah, 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 and Oprah this and blah, blah. But you're saying, I've gone through this, and I want to use this to help other people. And to me, that's so inspiring.
Mhm. It's interesting. I was on I've been on a bunch of different podcasts lately that are hosted by therapists, and they're sort of in awe of my ability to just kind of speak so freely and fluidly in between spiritual and therapeutic principles. And even talking to Dick, it's like when you're in that clinical space, it's sort of boundaried, and it's scary to step outside the lines. And I feel like this was my path. Like, I want to get further training and move into a new level of education. But I'm so grateful that I didn't have credentials in that way. It's a lot of spiritual training, but I didn't have credentials in that way because it allowed me to be the patient telling the story,
Mm-hmm.
not the doctor telling you what to do.
Right. With a doctor with all the answers.
Right.
Yeah,
Patient with experience.
right, right. Yeah, there's something very powerful about that. And again, something else I appreciate is this focus and appreciation and honor for the self and who we are, and the self and all of its complexity and its, hills and valleys. And there's something so beautiful about that. And it's so freeing about that too.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, true freedom. When you learn to let self lead, so maybe people call it God, maybe they call it higher self, maybe they call it inner wisdom, inner guidance. When you get access to that leader within you, it's like an internal parent. And so all of the ways that we were not receiving what we needed, we were not being seen or soothed or cared for by our own parents, we now have the immediate ability to receive that loving care and connection from ourselves.
mhm.
It's so profound. And it does, I think it does require IFS training and or of IFS therapy with a therapist, or any kind of therapy is often leading you closer to the self-compassion within. But IFS in particular is just extraordinarily profound. Just totally turns our perception of ourselves and our behaviors upside down.
When you first started your business, what was the impetus? What was the goal? What did you want to do?
Well, my first business was when I was 20 years old, and I ran it till I was 25 and ran myself into the ground. Didn't run the business into the ground. I ran myself into the ground. And that was running, was doing PR for nightclubs and restaurants and being a cocaine addict. And that career I started because I knew I loved to promote things that I believed in. At the time, I was really into partying. So that was what I was promoting. And thankfully, but all the while I had the stack of self-help books next to my bed. All the while I was reading Wayne Dyer, Shakti Gawain, Marianne Williamson, really a seeker.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 14 years old, I was the president of the regional Jewish youth group. And I was like leading these spiritual weekends and being a raconteur, being a spiritual teacher, getting on the microphone. So it was always in me, the seeker, the desire to serve, the leader in me. I'm an 8 in the Enneagram. I'm the epitome of an 8. So I was just really, I believe that I came into this body at this time to do this work. I got sober and within months was on stages speaking about my sober recovery and speaking about my spiritual faith and speaking about forgiveness and love and what I knew then.
Mm-hmm.
I just kept speaking year after year. I kept speaking about what I knew then and what I knew then and what I knew then.
So there was this part of you that was always, in a sense, using your own experience,
The whole time.
the whole time, which is
Every one of
terrific.
my books are based on my own personal experience. I write my books for myself first, and then I share them with others.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. I mean, right now, as you go through this, having just written this book, day to day, what are you challenged by? What are your challenges, do you think?
A challenge in the moment I may have is just it's not, I don't want to call it a challenge. It's an opportunity to witness this. I've launched 9 books. This is my 9th book I'm launching. So I've done a lot of these. I've been on this roadshow before. In this moment, I'm doing it so differently, from the standpoint that I'm just as busy as I ever was, but I'm somehow, but my direct access to self is this internal parent that's constantly checking in. Did you sleep enough? Did you drink enough water? Did you cuddle with your kitten long enough? Did you, and make sure not to do anything on the weekend, and just this real beautiful steadiness. So it's an opportunity to just really go through a busy time with that same worker part, but witness her in a less extreme role. And that's the beauty of IFS, is that there's no bad parts, as Dick says in his new book. There's no bad parts. All parts are necessary, but the goal is to let self help them be less extreme.
Right.
Because my worker part in a less extreme role is extraordinarily valuable.
That's so powerful. One of my, missions with this podcast has been to invite therapists to honor who they are, rather than this ideal of what a therapist or clinician should be. I think it's very natural for young therapists especially to get out of school and they've got this degree, and I certainly felt like I needed to be what a therapist should be like, whatever that was, and have all the answers. And it wasn't until I started doing this podcast and started asking a lot of my guests, what were some of the early clinical errors you learned? Could you share that? And I thought it was going to be I thought they were going to say, well, I forgot Bessel van der Kolk's page 222. I forgot this intervention or that intervention. And rather, it was, I didn't allow myself to be vulnerable. I didn't allow myself to be present. It was about them not seeing and not honoring and not believing themselves. And what you're saying here is us to be able to honor those parts of us, and it's not easy, but there's something so freeing in that.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Guy, because I think that for therapists, it's a tough gig, because it's a really hard job, but it's a tough gig because you need to stay boundaried. You want to not let in too much of who you are, but you want to have connection.
Right.
So, but the beauty of that's why I love IFS, because if you do therapy from self, so much of the IFS practice is about, if the patient doesn't have direct access to self in that moment, and they can only see how bad their parts are and be so in it, the therapist, the IFS therapist, can extend their own self energy they can be that bridge for the patient. And so I think it's important to recognize that you may not have to reveal every single detail of your life, but if you just simply drop in and make your tone of voice normal,
Right. Right.
and just lean in with some compassion and genuine curiosity, not like bullshit curiosity, but genuine curiosity, and really notice that energetic, subtle shift within yourself that really allows you to channel while you're in that, and co-regulate without creating codependency, but co-regulate. You extend that self energy to the patient, and they walk out of there feeling so connected to you, even though they know nothing about you. And that I've seen in one of my therapists in particular, in my EMDR therapist, is, I want to get her on your show. I'm going to CC you guys immediately. She's unfreaking believable, Guy. And the thing about Tammy is that she's so dropped in with you as a human. And it's her style. You know, everybody got different styles.
Right.
That really works for me. I don't know anything about her family. I mean, once in a while she'll say, oh, my kid's this or that. I don't know anything particularly about her, but I know her because she has opened her heart and her field to me. I actually interviewed her for my podcast, and she got on and she had just read Happy Days and she burst into tears, you know, and, you know, we, whether we like it or not, we often parentify our therapist, and to see her that just witness her seeing me in that way was so emotional for me. And it really means a lot to me, you know? So I think if you are a therapist, I would really say, like, oh God, I want to speak to these therapists right now so loudly. Don't be afraid to let down your guard, and don't be afraid to show the truth. And I think that in many ways you've been trained out of that. Right. And I pray for it to you to find a balance and a safe way of letting your self energy into the room.
Yeah. I couldn't think of a better message to put forth on this podcast. Speaking with Gabby Bernstein. Gabby, what's the best way? Well, first of all, the book is Happy Days. It's out.
Yeah, it's Happy Days, the guided path from trauma to profound freedom and inner peace. As a therapist, I think if you have a patient or a client that's very new to the trauma journey and just wanting to hear it through someone else's lens, first of all, read it and make sure you agree and like it before you before you recommend it. But I think it would be very valuable for someone that's beginning their journey, and maybe somebody that's just in an up leveling of their journey as well, or maybe even for the therapist that's listening, to hear it from the patient perspective.
Just before we go here, you know, we're talking a lot about parts and honoring them, accepting them. And how do you see the change in your own self before you started working on these parts, before you started recognizing that they were there? What's been that arc for you as you look now?
I'm a totally different person. I have clear boundaries. I am radically honest. I know how to speak with nonviolent communication. I can say anything to anyone. When I say it from self, I can say really tough stuff to people. But when it comes from my energy of self, I know it's safe. I can do less and attract more. I can be a steady, co-regulating presence in my toddler's life. I can get closer and more intimate to in my marriage. I can lead my team with great compassion, kindness, love, and still be the boss.
Because you're in closer contact with yourself, with who you are.
I'm closer. I'm letting self, my internal parent, be the leader. Not my 10-year-old self would about 50% of the time run my business. Not anymore. She's good. She's having a cappuccino across the street.
Gabby, I want to thank you for being here. It's been an incredible pleasure. I mean, I'm so glad we finally got to connect, and it's an honor having you on here. And the fact that you listen to my podcast, come on, how awesome is that?
Well, you're my favorite podcast, and I'm not bullshitting you. And I just think that your voice and your tone and your curiosity and the space that you hold for people creates such value for someone who's a seeker or a therapist that needs support. And I admire you. And it's so nice to join a podcast with a voice that you hear all the time. You know, you're like, I feel like I know you. So I have to gush for a moment and just say how grateful I am that I found you. Apple led me to you.
I appreciate that. How can people get in contact with you?
Well, I have a podcast called DearGabby.com. Oh, sorry. My podcast is called Dear Gabby. My website is DearGabby.com. And I'm very active on Instagram and all social channels at Gabby Bernstein.
Gabby, thank you so much. It's been amazing.
Thank you, my friend.
All right. Take care.
So fun. Thank you.